Well, I'm Sam Keir, and I'm serving as historian for the 5th Infantry Regiment Association. And a number of weeks ago, I was approached by Ed Ski that it would be good to have a discussion on the Battle of Ben Cui, which took place on August 21st, 1968, here at our reunion. And so we decided that we'd work that in, and it might turn into something that we want to do at subsequent reunions. For instance, next year we're going to be right there at Lundy's Lane, so we already know what battle is going to be featured next year. Next Wednesday is the 60th anniversary of the siege of Outpost Harry in the Chorwan Valley, when A Company and a couple of machine gun sections from D Company held off a reinforced regiment of Chinese as they fought through the night and pretty much wiped out that whole Chinese unit. So these are some things that are great episodes in the history of the 5th Infantry that we can get to from time to time. So what I'll do, I will be asking questions. I'll ask them initially of the panel. The panel can ask each other questions when we're talking about a certain concept. Those of you who are out there can make statements and ask questions, but we need to get your voice on tape. Major General retired Andy Anderson is on the panel. Andy was battalion commander of 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry at the time of the Battle of Ben Cui. John Snodgrass was the company commander of Charlie Company at that time. John was a first lieutenant, and as in many of our country's 20th century wars, there were shortages of captains, and so it was not uncommon for a senior lieutenant to be a company commander. Art Cook was a platoon leader when the morning started out, and then he took over the company when John was wounded. Art was a first lieutenant. Okay, Tom Frame was a squad leader at that time with Charlie Company, and Gary Young was a medic. So those are our panel participants. There are others of you out there who were there on that fateful day. I see Paul Moore in the back, and Abe right next to him, and Gary right next to him. So that we'll want to hear from you during the course of the morning. But to kind of set things going, I wanted to start with you, Andy, and that is that during the month of August, the entire 1st Brigade moved north to that area of Tainan and Daotiang, and what was the purpose of that move, and what was the mission?
I assumed command of the Bobcats while we were still down at Tonsanute in late June, and subsequently we moved the battalion up to Tainan and then back over to Daotiang. The Battle of Ben Cui, and I think it's important to keep in mind that I was the battalion commander, and I have to think in terms of the entire battalion. So I'll be talking about A, B, C, D Company eventually, and recon and so forth. The battle itself and the citation which we subsequently received, Presidential Unit Citation, began on the 18th of August and terminated on the 20th of September. During that period of time, there were several things that I, as a battalion commander, was responsible for and executed to the best of my ability. One was when I arrived and assumed command of the battalion, all of the personnel carriers were gas models. And when they were hit by either RPGs or mine actions that blew up the tracks, that vehicle would go up in smoke. And the casualties are pretty high when we were driving gasoline-driven vehicles. I wanted to, very quickly as possible, once I knew that diesel models were in country, get our hands on those particular vehicles and get rid of those gassers. And I asked Mike back there to please expedite getting diesel engine APCs as quickly as you can, which he did. And incidentally, I must say, Mike, you were one of the finest S4s that I've ever had the good fortune to work with. One of the other things that we did with our tracks was to, when we went out into static defensive positions, we placed cyclone fencing around these tracks. And why did I want to do that? That particular technique allowed for the capture of RPGs, 2s and 7s in their tail fins and caused a premature explosion of that chemical round before it would hit a track. And I know the guys were very ticked off about the fact that here we are picking up this heavy piece of metal fencing and carrying it around. But I can tell you, and they will agree with me, that we saved a number of lives, because when those RPGs start coming in like rain, those fins were captured in the mesh that we had surrounded around most of our tracks, completely around our tracks. The other third thing about the tracks that I had to deal with was that the brigade commander, 1st Brigade commander, came down one time there after we had an action. I never saw him during an action, but boy, he landed every time it ceased. And he landed in front of me, and he said, came running over to me, and he said, "I want you to put your men inside those tracks." I said, "Now, why do you want me to do that? Do you realize what happens when a track hits a mine? You haven't lived until you've reached into a track that has lost its tracks because of a mining action and pulled the driver out without his legs. I'm not putting my men inside those tracks when we're moving that track." I didn't have to worry about it. Why? Because he was never there when the shooting was going on. And so I just kept riding. And you know, not only did it save the lives of a number of our men, and it looked like hell. We're sitting on the top of these tracks, riding along, and here's an armored, so-called armored vehicle, and it couldn't stop most of the small arms anyway. But there we were, sitting on the top there, cracker boxes, with these lateral extensions on the laterals and an extension on the accelerator. I had a jump seat in the back of the rear of the vehicle, and believe me, when I got hit with that RPG, it blew me off the top. If I'd have been inside that vehicle, I would not be here today speaking with you people, I can assure you, because that round that hit me 6 inches below my left leg entered in on the left side of my track, and burned its way all the way through, right through the radios at the back of the track and out the other side. And that, to me, was reason enough to say, we ride on the top of the tracks, period. And that's some introductory comments into what we were facing with. I think someone else ought to be
well,
talking about.
I think so.
As far as the mission is concerned,
Good. Yeah. please. No, go
All
ahead.
right, well, we were rotating our command at the time. Companies would go out normally, singularly, with reinforcements. We had a surprisingly good number of outside units that supported us. And that was my job in coordinating such elements as we had a Duster platoon, which is a twin 40 millimeter cannon, a terrific weapon. We had a platoon of those folks. We had 2 scout dog platoons. They were instrumental in sniffing out or alerting us before we would run into something. And we had our own direct support artillery units. I could call on general support. On the 18th, when we overran the beginning of the fight we had with the 33rd and the 275th NVA regiments that had moved into our area, and that was the beginning of the contact and the continuous contact that we had with the enemy during that period that I mentioned to you. Our mission at the time, and specifically on the 21st, was to move through that area there with a purpose of cleaning out the Ben Cui 3 and 4, 1 and 2. We had 4 villages around Daotang that we had to deal with. And I think there was a reasonable amount of support provided to Charlie Company. I will admit it was the worst day that the 1st of the 5th ever experienced. I think it was the highest number of men we lost, unfortunately 18 men. I think about them quite often, and I know John on my right and Art Cook and everyone else who ever had anything to do with that fight. Remember to this day the men that we lost. It was a terrible day, and I can't say any more than that. I wish it never had happened, but believe me, I think my officers, we tried our best to get through that. It was our mission to sweep through the area. We just ran into 2 regiments, and we were 1 battalion.
That here, John. But that was one of the things I was wondering about, who the enemy was, and because I had read a number of memories had been written down for Dennis Hacken, and I had copies of those, and there was one. I think it was Paul Moore mentioned that the 2 enemy soldiers seen earlier had black pajamas on, and then somebody had said, well, there wasn't a Viet Cong presence at all still, and it was, at that time, and so I was kind of puzzled about that, and I wanted to know what you knew about who was there, or who was the enemy, their strength, and that sort of thing, their combat experience prior to that time.
The earliest indication that we had run into something bigger than a company or even a battalion size unit was the fact that we were taking fire from anti-aircraft 51 caliber machine guns. These are the type of weapons on tripods with a ring, a sight on it that allowed for the NVA to knock down our aircraft and also to place heavy fire on our tracks. That was the first indication, because this was very, very unusual to see these types of weapons in that area at this time. And we brought 3 of them back on the 18th on top of our tracks, and we had a trailer load of ammunition and small arms that we'd taken as we overran. Eventually, it took 3 waves. First wave, I called for napalm. Second wave, I called for 500 pound high-performance aircraft to come in there. We eventually had gunships involved. And Brigadier General Long, who was one of the two brigadier generals, observed our fight from the air. I was on my track, and we eventually overran that unit and realized that this anti-aircraft unit was bigger than what would be found with a battalion or even a regiment. So that's the first indication we had that something real big was in our area.